On the southern edge of Lake Michigan, there is a factory so large that the city beside it almost looks like an attachment. Blast furnaces, rail yards, smokestacks, ore docks, and miles of steel-making infrastructure stretch across the shoreline, while streets, churches, schools, and neighborhoods crowd right up to its edge. If you want to see how one factory could shape an entire American city, subscribe to Industrial Empire. This was Gary Works, the massive US steel plant built in northern Indiana. And Gary was not a normal city that later attracted a big employer. The employer came first. In 1906, US Steel chose this patch of sand and marsh as the site for one of the most ambitious industrial projects in the country. The company needed workers, housing, roads, utilities, and a civic structure to support the mill. So a city rose around it. Gary Works became the economic engine, the physical anchor, and the reason Gary existed. Which raises the question at the heart of this story. When the factory changes, what happens to the city built around it? At the start of the 20th century, American steel was becoming the skeleton of modern life. Railroads needed rails, cities needed beams, bridges, ships, factories, machines, and skyscrapers all demanded more metal, faster and cheaper than before. US Steel, formed in 1901, was already the giant of the industry. But to keep growing, it needed more than another mill. It needed a fully integrated steelworks, where raw materials could arrive in huge volumes, move through the production process, and leave as finished steel with as little friction as possible. That made location the first engineering problem. The southern shore of Lake Michigan offered something rare: direct access to the Great Lakes transportation system, with room for ore boats, docks, and heavy shipping infrastructure. Iron ore could come down from the Lake Superior region. Coal and limestone could be routed in by rail. Finished steel could move towards Chicago, the Midwest, and the rest of the country. The lake also solved a basic industrial need that no steel mill could ignore: water. Steel making consumed enormous quantities for cooling, steam, cleaning, and power. A site beside Lake Michigan gave the company a supply large enough for a plant built on a scale few Americans had ever seen. Chicago was close, but not too close. Its labor pool, rail connections, banks, and markets were nearby, while the Indiana shoreline offered cheaper land and fewer urban constraints. US Steel could draw from the region without having to squeeze a new industrial complex into an already crowded city. The land itself was the key. Much of the area was sand, wetlands, and sparsely developed property, which made it inexpensive compared with established industrial districts. The company could buy thousands of acres, lay out rail yards, furnaces, docks, worker housing, and streets as one coordinated project. Local tax conditions also helped. Indiana communities were eager for industrial investment, and favorable treatment made the project even more attractive. For US Steel, lower costs at the beginning meant greater control for decades afterward, so the choice was not simply a spot on a map. US Steel was choosing where raw materials, labor, water, transportation, land, and political advantage all came together. It was deciding where to plant an industrial empire. In 1906, before Gary was a real city in any ordinary sense, the mill arrived. US Steel began construction on Gary Works first. Crews moved onto the Indiana shoreline and started turning sand, marsh, and open land into one of the largest industrial building sites in the country. The factory was not added to an existing city. The city would grow around the factory. The work was enormous. Pile drivers hammered foundations into unstable ground. Rail lines were laid to move materials across the site. Docks were built along Lake Michigan so ore boats could unload directly into the industrial system. Coke ovens, blast furnaces, power facilities, machine shops, and rolling mills began taking shape as parts of one connected steelmaking machine. For a few seconds, this is the sound of a city being invented. By 1908, operations had begun. Iron ore, coal, limestone, steam, and labor could now flow through Gary Works in a planned sequence, from raw material to finished steel. The plant gave the place its reason to exist, and every road, track, and neighborhood that followed had to answer to that fact. Even the name made the relationship clear. The new city was called Gary, after Elbert H. Gary, the chairman of US Steel. Civic identity was tied directly to corporate leadership before the streets were fully settled and before the community had a long history of its own. That made Gary unusual from the beginning. It was not a town that slowly attracted industry over generations. It was an industrial project that required a town. Once the furnaces, rail yards, docks and mills were in place, US Steel had solved the physical problem. It had the land, the water, the transport routes and the machinery. The next problem was human. Someone had to run it all. Running Gary Works meant keeping an entire chain of production moving day and night. The process began before iron ever reached a furnace. Coal had to be baked into coke, a hotter, cleaner fuel strong enough to support the weight of a blast furnace charge. Iron ore came in by lake boat, limestone arrived as a flux, and rail cars carried materials between yards, ovens, furnaces and mills. Inside the blast furnaces, coke, ore and limestone were fed from the top, while superheated air blasted in from below. The result was molten iron tapped at temperatures that could turn a work floor into a dangerous landscape of heat, sparks and noise. That iron then moved into steel making. Impurities had to be burned out, chemistry adjusted, and molten metal transferred in huge ladles with little room for delay. A mistake in timing did not just slow one crew, it could interrupt the next stage of the plant. After that came rolling. Red-hot steel passed through giant rolls that squeezed it into rails, beams, plates, bars and sheets. Each product needed different equipment, different handling and different crews. Finishing departments cut, shaped, inspected and prepared the steel for shipment. Gary Works was not a single factory building with a front door and a whistle. It was a vast industrial organism. Coke ovens, blast furnaces, open hearth furnaces, rolling mills, powerhouses, repair shops, laboratories, stockyards, docks and rail yards, all tied together by schedules and tracks. Just keeping that organism alive required workers everywhere. Furnace men, mill hands, cranemen, switchmen, machinists, electricians, pipe fitters, labourers, clerks, inspectors and supervisors all had separate jobs, but the system depended on their work happening in sequence. The plant also reached far beyond Gary. Lake Michigan connected it to iron ore from the upper Great Lakes. Railroads connected it to coalfields, limestone quarries, markets and construction sites across the country. Raw materials came in from a national network and finished steel went back out into bridges, railroads, buildings, machines and ships. That meant the people working at Gary Works were not only serving one company town, they were standing inside a national supply chain, turning distant minerals into the steel that modern America needed. But the chain had one requirement that machines could not solve by themselves. Thousands of workers had to arrive, report to the gates and stay close enough to return for the next shift. And that created the next problem for US Steel. Where were all of those people supposed to live? US Steel did not just build Gary Works and wait for a city to appear around it. The company laid out the surrounding community because the mill needed workers close by, in large numbers, on a predictable schedule. The original company town stretched south from the plant toward roughly 9th Avenue. That placement was not accidental. The closer workers lived to the gates, the easier it was to fill shifts, replace absent men, and keep production moving through nights, weekends, and weather that could shut down longer commutes. So the first version of Gary was planned with the factory as its anchor. Streets were drawn in relation to the mill, residential blocks were placed where labour could reach the plant, commercial spaces, boarding houses and public buildings followed the same logic. The city's early map was a labour system turned into streets. Housing had to come fast. Some workers moved into company-built houses, others rented rooms in boarding houses where single men could sleep between shifts before returning to the furnaces, yards or rolling mills. Families needed more permanent homes, schools, shops, churches and basic services. The plant created demand for all of it at once. Roads, water lines, sewers, power and street lighting were not luxuries in this setting. They were part of making an industrial workforce stable enough to stay. A mill that depended on thousands of people could not function if those people had nowhere to sleep, no way to get to work, and no community infrastructure around them. This reversed the usual story of urban growth. Gary was not a quiet town that gradually attracted industry. The industry arrived first on a huge scale and then dictated where the town would go. Even the social geography reflected the plant. Supervisors, skilled workers, immigrant labourers and black workers did not experience the city in the same way, and housing access often followed lines of class, race and company power. The factory gave Gary its purpose, but it also helped shape who lived where and under what conditions. By the time the city began to fill in, its basic pattern was already set. The mill sat at the northern edge like the source of gravity, and the town extended away from it in ordered blocks, which raises a larger question: what kind of society forms when nearly every road, every paycheck and every daily routine leads back to the mill? By 1909, Gary had moved from blueprint to municipality. The place was formally incorporated as a city that year, only a short time after the first major construction began. The name was not about charm, it was about disbelief. A city seemed to have risen almost overnight from sand, marsh, railroad lines, and industrial ambition. By the time Gary incorporated, it already had around 12,000 residents. About half of them were foreign-born, which tells you how quickly the steel company's labour demand had reached across borders. The city was not filling up slowly with nearby farmers or small-town merchants. It was being populated by people who had travelled long distances because the mill promised work. European immigrants arrived from places like Poland, Slovakia, Croatia, Serbia, Hungary, Italy, Greece and Lithuania. Many came with experience in hard industrial labour. Others were young men willing to take dangerous jobs because steel wages could support relatives, pay debts or fund a future household. They joined American-born workers, migrants from other parts of the Midwest, and black workers who would become increasingly important to Gary's labour force in the years ahead. This created a city where dozens of languages, churches, newspapers, mutual aid societies and neighbourhood customs grew around the same central fact: the paychecks came from steel. The mill did not erase those differences, it placed them side by side. Men who might not share a language could still share a shift, a boarding house, a streetcar ride, or the same line outside the factory gate. Churches and social clubs helped immigrants hold on to identity, while the plant pulled them into one industrial schedule. That schedule shaped public life too. Politics in Gary quickly became tied to jobs, housing, ethnic voting blocks, labour disputes, and the enormous influence of US steel. Local businesses depended on mill wages, schools educated the children of steel workers, saloons, stores and street corners filled and emptied according to shift changes. So the Magic City was not just a nickname for fast construction, it described a social transformation happening at industrial speed. The mill was not only shaping Gary's skyline, it was shaping the city's demographics, politics, culture and daily rhythms. In Gary, the mill was not something people went to and left behind. It was the clock, the skyline, the weather and the background noise of ordinary life. A shift whistle could tell a household when to wake up, when to put coffee on, and when a street would fill with men heading toward the gates. Smoke from the furnaces settled into clothes and curtains. Railcars moved through the city carrying ore, coal, limestone and finished steel, making the tracks feel as permanent as the streets themselves. For a moment, imagine this as the city's daily soundtrack. When the shifts changed, Gary moved with them. Streetcars, sidewalks, saloons, lunch counters and boarding houses filled at predictable hours. Stores timed their busiest days around pay envelopes. Grocers, butchers, barbers, landlords and theatre owners all depended on the wages earned inside Gary Works. The same was true for the institutions that made the city feel settled. Schools educated the children of steel workers. Churches served congregations organised by language, ethnicity and neighbourhood, but their collection plates still depended on mill pay. City services, from paved streets to policing to sanitation, grew in a place where the tax base and population had been created by one industrial engine. For families, the bargain was clear, even when nobody said it out loud. The work was hot, loud, exhausting, and dangerous. Men faced burns, crushed limbs, toxic dust, explosions, and the constant risk of a mistake becoming fatal. In return, a steel paycheck could pay rent, buy food, support relatives, and eventually help a family move from a boarding room into a home. That paycheck built neighborhoods. It paid for school clothes, funeral dues, wedding halls, union memberships, church picnics, and the small luxuries that made industrial life feel survivable. Around the furnaces, people created routines that were not just about work, but about belonging. Yet the deeper Gary grew around the mill, the harder it became to separate the city's future from the company's fortunes. A good year at Gary Works meant crowded shops and steady households. A slowdown meant unpaid bills, quiet streets, and fear spreading from the plant into every neighborhood. Gary's strength was its concentration. One massive factory had given the city jobs, people, money, and purpose. But that same concentration was becoming its weakness. The city had been built around steel, and that meant any shot to steel would not stay inside the mill gates. This was the central design of Gary, one employer at the core, and an entire city arranged around its needs. United States Steel did not simply build a plant and wait for a town to appear. The company chose the land, laid out streets, created industrial access, and attracted the workers who would turn raw materials into finished steel. Housing followed the payroll. Merchants followed the housing. Banks, schools, newspapers, churches, and city government grew in the space created by one enormous industrial bet. That made Gary different from older cities where factories were added to an existing urban economy. In Gary, the factory came first. The city was, in practical terms, an extension of the mill's labour system. If Gary Works needed more men, the population grew. If the plant ran hard, rent was paid, shops expanded, and public officials could plan around rising tax revenue. For a time, this looked like a powerful model. A worker could arrive with little more than a suitcase and find a path into the industrial middle class. Immigrant families, black families moving north during the Great Migration, and white workers from rural America all entered a city where steel offered a common economic language. The work was divided by race, skill, seniority, and status, but the paychecks came from the same source. Gary's civic identity became inseparable from that source. The city did not have to search for a brand. It was steel. Its skyline proved it. Its labour force proved it. Its place in the national economy proved it every time American railroads, bridges, appliances, ships, and buildings used metal shaped along the southern shore of Lake Michigan. But a one-employer city carries a hidden condition. The same company that fills the pay envelopes can also decide how many envelopes exist. A production target, a labour dispute, an investment delay, or a change in technology can move through the city faster than any local policy can stop it. No mayor, school board, shopkeeper, or homeowner controlled those decisions. They were made in corporate offices, inside markets for steel, and inside calculations about efficiency and cost. Gary could benefit from being close to the furnace, but it did not control the furnace. So the question became unavoidable. What happens to a city built around steelmaking when steelmaking learns to produce more with fewer people? The answer was not that the mill disappeared. Gary Works remained a vast industrial presence, with blast furnaces, rolling mills, rail lines, ore docks, and miles of equipment still dominating the lakefront. The change was that the same kind of production no longer required the same number of human beings. Across the steel industry, the old labour model began to break apart. New machinery handled tasks that once took large crews. Computer controls made production more precise. Continuous casting reduced steps in the process. Better logistics moved raw materials and finished steel with fewer delays. At the same time, American steel faced pressure from foreign competitors, newer domestic mini-mills, changing demand, and corporate restructuring. These changes were not small adjustments. They altered the basic relationship between output and employment. A modernised plant could still make enormous quantities of steel, but it could do it with a fraction of the workforce that earlier generations had considered normal. Productivity rose, but payroll shrank. For the company, this could be described as efficiency. For Gary, it landed as a civic shock. Each eliminated job was not just one missing worker inside the gate. It was a household with less income, a mortgage under pressure, a customer gone from a local store, and a smaller tax base for the city. The difficult part was that the factory could keep succeeding by industrial standards while the city around it lost the conditions that had supported daily life. A mill manager could point to tons of steel shipped, costs reduced, and equipment upgraded. A mayor had to look at vacant houses, fewer stable paychecks, strained schools, and public services trying to cover the same streets with less money. Local businesses felt the shift quickly. Restaurants that had depended on shift changes saw fewer lunch pails and work boots. Retail corridors that once served mill families lost steady traffic. Property values weakened in neighbourhoods where the promise of a steel job had once made homeownership feel secure. This is what made Gary's decline different from a simple story of a factory closing. The physical plant did not vanish from the map. It remained massive, active, and nationally important. But its role as the city's great employer had changed. The machine that once needed a city of workers had learnt to run with fewer people. And that left Gary facing a brutal contradiction. The factory that had pulled the city into existence could continue operating while the city struggled to survive beside it. By the time the employment base had shrunk, Gary was left with a city plan built for a much larger industrial society. The streets, schools, churches, business districts, and housing blocks had all been shaped by the assumption that steelwork would remain the centre of everyday life. Neighbourhoods were not just near the mill, they were organised around its schedules, its wages, and the belief that each generation could find a place somewhere in the industrial chain. That assumption had once made Gary feel unusually purposeful. A worker could live close to the plant, shop along Broadway, send children to local schools, and see the skyline of the mill as proof that the city had a reason to exist. Civic identity and corporate geography overlapped so closely that the factory gates were more than an entrance to a workplace. They were the boundary around which the city understood itself. But a city is harder to downsize than a payroll. When jobs disappeared, the streets still had to be paved, water lines still had to be maintained. Police, fire, sanitation, libraries and schools still had to serve a landscape designed for a bigger tax base. Vacant lots and abandoned buildings did not simply mark private loss, they made public services more expensive to deliver across the same physical area. The result was a mismatch between Gary's built environment and its new economic reality. The city had the bones of a major industrial centre, but fewer of the steady paychecks that had once filled those bones with activity. Population loss made the mismatch sharper. As families moved away, the distance between occupied homes increased, commercial corridors thinned out, and institutions that depended on local participation weakened. Gary Works still occupied a tremendous footprint along Lake Michigan. From above, it could look as commanding as ever. But its social footprint had narrowed. Fewer households were directly tied to the mill. Fewer children grew up assuming that a job there would define their adult lives. Fewer small businesses could count on the rhythm of shift workers passing through their doors. That is the deeper lesson in Gary's story. A factory can build streets, attract migrants, fund ambition, and give a new city an instant identity. It can create gravity, but it cannot guarantee that the community built around it will remain secure once the logic of the industry changes. Gary was not just left with a mill, it was left with the city that the mill had made. Gary did not become an industrial city because a factory happened to arrive there. Gary became a city because US Steel chose that specific stretch of Lake Michigan and then built a factory large enough to require an entire urban world around it. The location came first: water access, rail connections, open land, and proximity to Chicago. Then came Gary Works, with its furnaces, mills, docks, and yards. After that came the labour demand, and labour demand pulled in families, housing, stores, schools, churches, banks, theatres, and politics. What began as an industrial site became a civic map. That is the central reversal of Gary's origin story. The city did not simply host the mill created the conditions that made the city possible. And that is also what made the later pain so concentrated. Gary's rise was not built on a broad mix of industries. It was built around one enormous engine. When that engine expanded, the city expanded with it. When it needed fewer workers, the city absorbed the shock in its neighbourhoods, its tax base, its public services, and its sense of identity. Gary Works was never just a workplace. It was a machine that made steel, an employer that shaped family futures, and a city builder that turned empty land into streets and institutions. Its power gave Gary a sudden place in American industry, but its dominance also left Gary tied to decisions and forces far beyond City Hall. The mill still stands along the lake, active and immense. It is both monument and machine, proof that industrial geography can shape not just a skyline, but generations of lives. Thanks for watching. If you have a connection to Gary, steelwork, or another company town, write it in the comments. Gary, Indiana is a reminder that industrial power does not only make products, it can make streets, jobs, schools, politics, and a city's entire future. But when one employer becomes the foundation, the same force that creates prosperity can also create vulnerability. Gary's story is not just about steel. It is about what happens when a place is built around one giant. Thanks for watching. If you know another factory-built town, company town, mill city, or industrial site with a story worth telling, write it in the comments. And if you enjoyed this documentary, like, subscribe, and watch the next episode.